Welcome back to Season 2 of CSS Breakdown, book by book. In this season, we're exploring Roger Hopkins Burke's An Introduction to Criminological Theory. In Episode 2, we turn to the foundations of the rational actor model, examining the classical school of criminology and its modern revival through populist conservative thinking. Welcome back, everyone. So today we're really digging into, well, maybe one of the most fundamental questions in criminology. Why do people commit crime? And specifically, we're looking at an idea that honestly feels pretty intuitive, doesn't it?
Which idea is that?
The idea that people commit crime because they choose to, that they make a rational calculation.
Ah, right, the rational actor model.
Exactly. It sounds simple, but when you trace its history, which is what we'll do today based on Hopkins Burke, it unfolds into this really complex story, and it has huge implications for, how we think about justice, punishment, the whole system.
It absolutely does. And it's fascinating because for ages, the explanations were often rooted in spiritual beliefs. Crime is the devil's work or maybe just inherent sinfulness.
Right, blaming external forces or innate evil.
Exactly. But then, around the late 18th century, the Enlightenment happens, and everything starts to shift. Thinkers, philosophers, reformers, they began looking at human behavior through a totally different lens, a naturalistic one.
Naturalistic, meaning based on observable human nature.
Yes, based on reason, on observation, on individual choice, moving away from the spiritual explanations. And this was heavily influenced by the social contract theorists, people like Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, who were grappling with how societies actually form and function based on, consent and agreement among people.
So instead of pointing fingers at demons, they started looking at the person, at their decision-making process.
That's the core idea, and it was revolutionary for its time. The notion that crime isn't some unavoidable fate or because someone's possessed by an evil spirit, but it's actually the result of deliberate choices.
Choices people make.
Choices people make. The thinking was essentially that individuals weigh up the potential upsides of committing a crime, the gain, the pleasure, whatever, against the potential downsides, particularly the risk and the cost of getting caught and punished.
Okay, so our mission today then, based on this chapter, is to really unpack those foundational ideas. Where did this rational actor model come from? That's the classical school.
Right, Beccaria, Bentham.
We'll get into them. Then we need to understand what happened when these, let's say, elegant theories met messy reality. That led to something called the neoclassical compromise.
A necessary adjustment.
We'll look at how these, frankly, quite old ideas still have a huge imprint on our legal systems today. And then we'll jump forward, quite a big jump, actually, to the late 20th century.
To a revival.
Exactly. To explore how a specific political and intellectual movement, populist conservative thinking, or what the book calls right realism, brought this rational actor model roaring back. Not just as a principle for law, but as the primary explanation for why crime happens. And crucially, what that meant for policy. Get tough policies, for instance.
And I think what makes this whole journey so interesting and relevant even now is how it throws these enduring fundamental debates into sharp relief. Questions about free will versus determinism.
How much choice do we really have?
Exactly. And what's the real purpose of justice? Is it about paying a debt? Is it about scaring people straight? Is it about fixing the offender? Or maybe just protecting society? And how should society respond when the rules are broken? These tensions are still right there, embedded in our justice systems.
Let's start right at the beginning of that shift then. The material really pinpoints Cesare Beccaria in Italy as, well, a truly pivotal figure around the 1760s. Interestingly, he was a mathematician. Seems an odd path to legal reform.
It does seem a bit unusual, but maybe that mathematical mind sought logic and system where there was chaos. His book on crimes and punishment from 1767 was, as you said, a complete game changer. Translated into 22 languages back then, that's huge. Its impact was immediate and widespread.
What was driving him? What problem was he trying to solve?
Well, according to the source material, his main motivation was a deep opposition to the sheer inconsistency and, frankly, the barbarity he saw in the government's and justice systems of his day.
So, arbitrary punishments, secret accusations, that kind of thing.
Exactly. It was often brutal, unpredictable, lacked any real system. His book was really the first major attempt, as Hopkins Burke highlights, to lay out a blueprint for a systematic, consistent, logical penal system, one grounded in reason and principles, not just based on tradition or the whims of judges or rulers.
And he wasn't vague about it. He had some incredibly specific proposals for this new system. What were the big ones?
He had several core ideas that were quite radical. First, This concept that anyone who commits a crime owes a debt to society, and the punishment should be strictly proportional to the seriousness of that crime, to the harm done. Nothing more, nothing less.
Proportionality. That sounds familiar.
Very. And he was vehemently against torture. He saw it as barbaric, obviously, but also, from his rational viewpoint, as useless for investigation.
Useless. Why?
Well, the source emphasizes his reasoning. It's useless for finding the right offender. Think about it. Someone under extreme pain might confess to anything, true or false. They might implicate innocent people just to make the pain stop. It doesn't lead to truth.
That makes sense. What about the death penalty?
He argued capital punishment was unnecessary. He thought a life sentence involving hard labor was actually preferable.
Preferable. Why?
Two reasons, really. It still served as a significant punishment, obviously, but it also acted as a more enduring deterrent. A living example of the consequences of crime, rather than the brief spectacle of an execution, which might quickly fade from public memory.
So he wasn't advocating for softer punishment necessarily, just different kinds? More imprisonment.
Yes, he advocated for using imprisonment much more widely than it had been. But, and this is key, he also demanded significant improvement in prison conditions, less squalor, less chaos, and crucially, segregation of inmates.
Segregation how?
By gender, by age, and by the degree of their criminality. Trying to bring some order and rationality even within the prison walls, preventing, say, minor offenders from being corrupted by hardened criminals.
And you mentioned this tied back to social contract theory. How did that fit in?
Absolutely essential. Beccaria was a firm believer in the social contract, the idea that people agree to give up a little bit of their individual freedom to the state in return for security and order. Law, for him, was the essential framework codifying this agreement.
And punishment.
Punishment was the necessary tool to enforce that contract, to defend the liberties of law-abiding citizens against those who would violate the agreement and harm others.
Okay, so this is where his core idea about why people commit crime comes in. The rational actor part.
Exactly. This is the heart of it. Beccaria's theory of criminal behavior rests on two pillars: free will and hedonism.
Free will, meaning people choose their actions. Hedonism.
Hedonism is the pleasure-pain principle, the idea that humans are fundamentally motivated by seeking pleasure and avoiding pain. All our actions, he thought, are purposive, aimed at achieving something we want or avoiding something we don't.
So crime is just another calculation of pleasure versus pain.
Essentially, yes. Someone considers committing a crime, they weigh the potential pleasure or gain against the potential pain of punishment. For punishment to work, to deter, its pain must clearly outweigh the expected pleasure from the crime.
Makes logical sense.
And here's the really radical part for the legal system. He insisted these punishments must be fixed, predetermined, written down clearly in the law for every specific offense. And this is crucial. There should be no room for judges to exercise discretion or interpret the law based on individual circumstances.
No judicial discretion at all. That sounds incredibly rigid. Our system relies heavily on judges making calls based on the specifics of the case.
It was absolutely rigid. Beccaria believed the law had to apply equally to everyone. The court's only function, in his view, was to determine one thing. Did the accused commit the act defined as criminal in the law? Yes or no?
So no consideration for why they did it, their background, their mental state?
None. No mitigation of guilt was allowed. If you were found guilty of a specific offense, you received the exact same penalty that the law prescribed for that offense, regardless of whether you were a first-timer or a repeat offender, rich or poor, young or old, though later neoclassicists would adjust this. It was all about achieving maximum consistency, predictability, and certainty, equality before the law taken to its logical extreme.
The source material lays out 13 specific propositions from Beccaria's essay. Maybe walking through those would really flesh out his system.
Yeah, that's a good idea. They really build the picture systematically. Let's see. First, the foundation. People sacrifice some liberty to the state to escape chaos. That's the social contract baseline. Second, punishments are needed to stop people breaking those laws and messing with other people's liberty. Pretty straightforward.
Makes sense.
Third, and this is interesting, he talks about the despotic spirit, basically, the tendency to offend being in everyone. Crime isn't just for some bad group. It's a potential in all of us, needing deterrence.
Universal potential. Okay.
Fourth, who decides punishments? The legislature, the elected representatives of society, not the courts.
So judges don't make law or decide penalties. They just apply what the legislature dictates.
Exactly. Which leads to the fifth point. Judges must only impose the punishments already established in law. Consistency, certainty again.
Got it.
Sixth, How do you judge how serious a crime is? By the harm it does to society, not by the offender's intent or their personal motivations. It's about the outcome, the impact.
That's a big one. Focus on the act, not the actor's mind.
Seventh, punishments must be proportional to that harm. There should be a scale, a tariff of penalties, with the most severe reserved for crimes that harm society most, like those threatening its stability.
A scale of seriousness.
Eighth, punishment needs to be prompt, swift justice. Why? Because the closer the punishment follows the crime, the stronger the mental link between the bad act and the negative consequence, makes deterrence more effective.
Swift and certain.
Ninth is certainty itself. Punishment must be certain to be effective. He really believed the likelihood of being punished was a far greater deterrent than the severity, if that severity was uncertain.
That feels counterintuitive to a lot of tough on crime talk today, which often focuses just on severity.
It does, but it was central to his logic. 10th, laws and punishments have to be public knowledge. Clearly written, widely accessible. People can't make rational choices if they don't know the rules and the consequences.
Rationality requires information.
11th, punishment is purely for deterrence. Therefore, capital punishment is unnecessary. Life imprisonment with hard labor is enough pain to deter without the state resorting to killing.
So deterrence, not retribution primarily.
12th, prevention is better than punishment. Clear laws, certain and swift consequences, these aim to prevent crime in the first place.
Makes sense.
And finally, 13th, anything not explicitly forbidden by law is allowed. This preserves individual liberty and limits the state's reach. Only punish what society, through its laws, has clearly defined as harmful.
Wow. Looking at that list, it's incredible how much of that blueprint is still, the bedrock of modern Western legal systems. Legality, proportionality, the idea of a sentencing tariff, public laws.
The doctrine of free will is the basis for responsibility.
Right. What really strikes you the most when you look back at Beccaria's core ideas? What feels most relevant or maybe even challenging today?
For me, it's that emphasis on certainty over severity.
Yeah.
That's a lesson that feels constantly relevant, especially when public debate often defaults to demanding harsher and harsher penalties without necessarily considering if they'll actually be applied consistently or swiftly. Beccaria's insight that a smaller, guaranteed punishment is likely more effective than a brutal but rare one.
Yeah.
That still feels radical. And also, that stark rejection of judicial discretion. It highlights this fundamental tension we still gravel with. How do you balance the ideal of treating everyone equally under the law with the reality of individual circumstances, mitigating factors, and the potential for rehabilitation? Beccaria went all in on equality, but reality forced a compromise later.
Absolutely. Okay, let's hop across the channel now to Britain and talk about Jeremy Bentham. The source calls him a leading disciple of Beccaria, but also a major figure in his own right, utilitarian philosopher.
Bentham is huge, yeah. Deeply influenced by Beccaria, but also by philosophers like John Locke, particularly Locke's idea that we aren't born with innate ideas or original sin. We learn through experience.
And how did that shape Bentham's view of crime if we're not born bad?
Then criminal behavior for Bentham wasn't down to some inherent evil nature. It resulted from basically a bad upbringing, faulty socialization, a failure to learn the right way to be held in society.
So criminals weren't fundamentally different, they just hadn't learned properly.
Kind of. He described them almost like forward children. Individuals who lacked the self-discipline, the internalized reason to control their passions and make the correct, socially acceptable choices. This lack of control stemmed from their poor socialization, in his view, though they still possessed free will as adults.
And his overall framework was similar to Beccaria's, but seen through that utilitarian lens.
Exactly. His guiding star was utilitarianism.
Okay.
The greatest happiness for the greatest number. So, yes, he agreed people are rational, seeking pleasure and avoiding pain. Punishment's pain had to outweigh the crime's pleasure to deter. But the total amount of pain inflicted by the legal system shouldn't be so excessive that it actually reduced the overall happiness of society. There had to be a balance.
So the law should focus on preventing harm that reduces overall happiness.
Precisely. Control acts harmful to society, acts that diminish collective happiness. The law shouldn't necessarily be in the business of regulating private morality if it wasn't causing wider harm.
Now, he agreed with Beccaria on capital punishment being barbaric.
Yes, he did.
But he had a different take on torture, which you mentioned earlier. That's really interesting.
It is a fascinating divergence, isn't it? Both starting from reason, but reaching different conclusions. Bentham, being utilitarian, thought torture might be justifiable if, and only if, its use could produce a greater good. prevent a greater harm, and thus increase overall happiness.
So the example you gave earlier, getting information to stop a bomb.
Potentially, yes. If the pain inflicted on one person through torture could demonstrably prevent immense suffering for many others, a strict utilitarian might argue it's the rational choice in that extreme circumstance. Contrast that with Beccaria, who focused on its unreliability for finding the truth about the past crime. Bentham's looking forward, can it prevent future harm? It really shows how the underlying philosophy shapes the application of rationality.
That's a really critical distinction, and the source mentions a hint in Bentham that maybe crime could be learned behavior despite his belief in free will.
Yes, it's a subtle point, but important. His emphasis on upbringing and socialization, while not denying free will in the responsible adult, does sort of crack the door open to considering how external factors shape behavior. It foreshadows later theories that would focus much more heavily on learning and environment.
Now, Bentham is almost synonymous with one particular idea, the Panopticon prison.
Ah, the Panopticon.
Yeah.
Yes, designed around 1791. It's iconic, partly because it's such a stark physical manifestation of his ideas about surveillance and control. You have to remember, prisons at the time were often just chaotic holding pens. Bentham envisioned something rational, efficient.
What was the design?
It was circular, tiers of cells built around a central observation tower. The genius, or perhaps the horror of it, was the lighting and architecture. The guard or jailer in the central tower could, in theory, see into any cell at any time. But the prisoners in the cells couldn't see into the tower. They never knew if they were being watched at any given moment.
So it's the possibility of being watched, the uncertainty, that enforces discipline.
Precisely. Bentham called it the inspection principle. He believed this constant, unverifiable surveillance would make inmates regulate their own behavior. Physical restraints like chains, he argued, would become unnecessary. The mind would control the body through the fear of being seen.
And the regime inside was meant to be productive.
Oh, very. He envisioned prisoners working incredibly long hours, something like 16 hours a day, and the profits generated from their labor would go to the prison owner or contractor. His famous description of the Panopticon was a mill for grinding rogues honest.
Grinding rogues honest. It's a chilling phrase. And the book notes he saw this inspection principle as having much broader applications.
Yeah, absolutely. He wasn't just thinking about prisons. He saw the Panopticon design and its underlying principle of surveillance and control as a model for all sorts of institutions that needed internal regulation, discipline, and efficiency. Schools, hospitals, workhouses, asylums, factories, anywhere you needed to manage and shape behavior.
So it was a blueprint for social control, really, applied across society.
In many ways, yes. And later thinkers, like Ignatieff quoted in the source, saw these various institutions, prisons, factories, schools, workhouses, as interconnected. They often had similar designs, similar disciplinary methods, even a shared language of reform and control.
Ignatieff talks about them resembling factories.
Yes, their imposing architecture, often resembling factories, became new landmarks on the urban skyline. They symbolize this new approach, rationalizing human activity, instilling discipline, aiming for human improvement through regimentation. This drew on various strands of thought, religious ideas about asceticism and hard work, Enlightenment faith in reason and improvability, and the liberal state's need for order and efficiency.
And Foucault famously analyzed this rise of the carceral society.
Foucault's work is key here. He details the intense regimentation that characterized these new institutions. The source mentions his description of the House of Young Prisoners in Paris, every moment dictated by rules, signaled by drum rolls, for waking, dressing, praying, working. It was about creating disciplined bodies and minds through constant supervision and timetable. While the pure Panopticon wasn't widely built exactly as Bentham designed it in England, its principles, constant supervision, classification, work discipline, routine heavily influenced subsequent prison design, like Pentonville Prison in London, which then became a model globally.
It sounds like Bentham was overwhelmingly focused on punishment and control, but the source does mention he also had some interest in crime prevention.
Yes, it's important not to caricature him solely as the architect of control. Alongside his elaborate penal schemes, he did also propose measures aimed at prevention, like addressing social problems like alcoholism and suggesting state care for the poor. So there was some recognition of broader social factors, even if the main thrust was deterrence and discipline through rational systems.
Okay, so the classical school with Beccaria and Bentham gave us this seemingly logical, systematic framework based on rational choice, deterrence, proportionality. But you mentioned it ran into problems when applied in the real world. What happened?
Well, exactly that. Theory met reality, and reality was messier. The French Penal Code of 1791 is a key example because it was heavily influenced by these classical ideas, particularly Beccaриa's insistence on fixed penalties and no judicial discretion.
And it didn't work out as planned.
It created significant problems almost immediately. The fundamental flaw, as Hawkins-Burke points out, was its complete blindness to individual differences.
How so?
It treated everyone identically based solely on the act committed. A first-time offender got the exact same mandatory sentence as a hardened recidivist. More crucially, it treated children, people with severe mental impairments. The feeble-minded, as they termed it then, and the certifiably insane as if they were fully rational, competent individuals capable of making free choices.
Which is clearly not the case.
Absolutely not. And this wasn't just an abstract injustice. It caused practical problems that undermined the legitimacy of the whole new system. Imagine a courtroom where someone clearly incapable of understanding the proceedings, let alone forming criminal intent in a meaningful way, is sentenced as if they were a calculating adult. It just didn't sit right. It felt fundamentally unfair and nonsensical.
So they had to change it.
They did. Revisions were made to the French Code fairly quickly by 1810 and then again in 1819, specifically to give judges back some degree of latitude in sentencing. They had to allow consideration of circumstances. This, of course, breached the pure, elegant philosophical consistency of classicism. There was this unavoidable, growing recognition that people are simply not equally responsible for their actions. Circumstances matter. Individual capacity matters.
And is this where the idea of bringing in experts to assess people comes from?
Exactly. This practical need for differentiation opened the door for non-legal experts to enter the courtroom. Doctors initially, then psychiatrists, and eventually social workers. Their role was to provide opinions on the accused's state of mind, their degree of reason, their level of culpability.
To help the judge figure out how responsible someone actually was.
Precisely. Judges could now vary sentences based on these expert assessments of individual responsibility, alongside other mitigating circumstances presented in the case. The sentence started to be tailored, at least somewhat, to the individual, not just the crime.
Okay, so this adaptation, this theoretical compromise, acknowledging individual differences while still broadly holding on to free will, this is what became known as the neoclassical school.
That's right. Thinkers associated with neoclassicism, like Rossi, Garrod, and Joly, effectively modified the strict free will doctrine of the original classicists.
How did they modify it?
They maintained that ordinary, sane adults should still be considered fully responsible, capable of choosing between criminal and non-criminal actions. However, they explicitly acknowledged that certain groups were inherently less capable of exercising free choice.
Like children.
Yes, children were seen as less capable and therefore less responsible. Sometimes the elderly were included too. And people deemed insane or feeble-minded were seen as potentially even less responsible, perhaps not responsible at all in some cases.
And the source highlights this as a really crucial turning point.
It is, because this admission that innate predisposing factors related to age or mental capacity might constrain or even determine behavior is the thin end of the wedge. It lays the conceptual groundwork for the entirely different predestined actor model that would come to dominate criminology later, the idea that crime is caused by forces beyond individual control.
So the neoclassical school formally brought the experts in.
Yes. Doctors, psychiatrists, social workers were formally admitted into the justice system. Their job was to identify these relevant biological, psychological, or social differences and help the court decide the extent of an offender's responsibility.
Leading to more individualized sentences.
Exactly. Sentences became less about a fixed tariff for the crime and more dependent on the perceived responsibility of the individual offender and any mitigating factors.
And the idea of rehabilitation started to creep in more strongly here, too.
Yes, because once you acknowledge that people are different and responsibility varies, the purpose of punishment also starts to shift. If someone is deemed less responsible or perhaps capable of change, then the sentence might be geared towards rehabilitation, towards what's appropriate for that specific person, recognizing that the same punishment might have vastly different effects on different individuals.
The source quotes Taylor, Walton, and Young on this, saying it wasn't a complete rejection of free will.
Right. They make the point that neoclassicism didn't entirely abandon the rational actor. The criminal was still seen as needing to make correct moral choices. But there was this growing awareness that the ability to make that free choice isn't equal for everyone. Certain circumstances, certain individual characteristics make exercising free will harder or easier.
So it's like free will exists, but it operates within constraints. That sounds like a bit of a tricky balance.
It is a very tricky balance. And Hopkins' book argues quite persuasively that most modern criminal justice systems are essentially founded on this awkward theoretical compromise. They try to hold on to the idea of rational choice and individual responsibility, the classical neoclassical view, while simultaneously acknowledging the influence of biological, psychological, and social factors that might determine behavior, the predestined actor view.
So we're still living with that tension today.
Absolutely. That fundamental debate, free will versus determinism, is arguably one of the most enduring and unresolved arguments across all the human and social sciences, and it plays out every day in our courtrooms and prisons.
Okay, before we jump forward to the modern revival, maybe let's quickly summarize the key attributes and the main criticisms of these classical and neoclassical schools as laid out in the source material.
Sure. The source identifies 4 central attributes.
A primary focus on criminal law and the legal definition of crime. What does the law say is illegal?
Okay, focused on the law itself. Criticism.
The main criticism is that this ignores the fact that legal definitions are social constructions. What counts as a crime changes over time and across different cultures. It's not a fixed, objective category.
Right. Second attribute.
Punishment should fit the crime, not the criminal. The penalty is determined by the offense committed.
And the criticism there.
It fails to appreciate individual differences. Differences in culpability, motivation, background, potential for rehabilitation. It treats unequals as if they were equal.
Makes sense. Third.
The core belief in free will, allied with hedonism. People choose their actions rationally to maximize pleasure and minimize pain. It assumes there's nothing inherently different or special about people who commit crimes compared to those who don't. They just made a different calculation.
And the criticism.
Again, it fails to appreciate that the exercise of free will is often heavily constrained by factors outside immediate control: biology, psychology, social circumstances, poverty, lack of opportunity, and so on.
Okay, and the fourth attribute.
Methodology. It was essentially non-scientific, what the source calls armchair theorizing, based on logic, anecdote, maybe imaginary illustrations, rather than empirical research or data collection about actual criminals or crime patterns. It was primarily an administrative and legal criminology, concerned with creating uniform laws and punishments, not really with explaining the causes of criminal behavior in a scientific sense. And it's worth repeating. While this rational actor model fell out of fashion as the dominant explanation for crime by the end of the 19th century, replaced by positivist, predestined actor models looking for causes, its core principles never disappeared from the practice of criminal justice.
So even when sociology and psychology were looking for root causes, the courts and the legal system still operated on many of these classical assumptions. Where specifically do we see that enduring influence today?
It's baked into the cake, really. Think about legal doctrines like mens rea, the guilty mind. The whole idea of proving conscious intent or choice is fundamentally a rational actor concept.
Right, you have to have chosen to do it.
Yeah, exactly. Sentencing principles still heavily rely on judging culpability and responsibility. How much free choice did the person exercise? And the entire structure of punishment, that sentencing tariff where penalties escalate based on the seriousness of the offense, that's pure Beccaria, proportionality. Philosophically, its clearest reflection today is probably in the just deserts approach to sentencing.
Just deserts. That sounds very much like getting what you deserve.
Yeah.
What are its core principles, according to the source?
The source lists 4 basic ones.
Only a person found guilty by a court, following due process, could be punished.
Anyone found guilty must be punished. No exceptions based on perceived need for treatment, for instance.
The punishment must not be more severe than is proportionate to the seriousness of the crime and the offender's culpability.
And crucially, the punishment must not be less severe than is proportionate either.
Those principles sound almost like direct quotes from Beccaria, don't they? Free will, rationality, strict proportionality, equality before the law, focus on the offense, equal punishment for the same crime.
Absolutely. And importantly, Just Deserts philosophy explicitly rejects things like individualized treatment or rehabilitation as legitimate primary aims of sentencing. The goal is justice, which means administering the deserved punishment. It's closely linked to that traditional classical notion of due process fairness and adherence to rules in the legal process.
You mentioned due process earlier. The source uses Herbert Packer's framework from the 1960s to talk about this ongoing tension between due process values and crime control values in the system. Can you unpack that a bit?
Packer's model is really helpful for understanding the competing priorities within criminal justice. The due process model prioritizes reliability and fairness. Its main goal is to ensure guilt is proven beyond a reasonable doubt in an open adversarial trial. It embodies the ideal of the rule of law. The state has the power to punish, but only if it meets a high burden of proof according to strict rules.
Presumption of innocence is key here.
Central. It requires strong rules governing police powers, how evidence is gathered and admitted, and protects the rights of suspects and defendants. It sees state power as necessary but potentially dangerous, requiring checks and balances. Informal procedures, discretionary power, these are viewed with suspicion. It accepts the risk that some guilty people might go free as the necessary price to prevent the greater evil of convicting the innocent or allowing unchecked state power.
What's the downside?
The perceived downside is that it can look inefficient. High acquittal rates might undermine public confidence or deterrence if people think they can get away with it.
Okay, so what's the crime control model?
The crime control model prioritizes efficiency, speed, and finality. The main goal is to repress criminal conduct, catch, convict, and punish offenders quickly to maintain public order. There is almost an implicit presumption of guilt once someone is caught in the system's net. The focus shifts to processing them efficiently.
Less concern for legal hurdles.
Generally, yes. Legal controls that protect defendants can be seen as obstacles or loopholes that hinder the swift punishment of the guilty. It's more willing to tolerate occasional errors, like an innocent person being convicted, if the overall system is seen as effectively controlling crime. The focus is on protecting victims and society, rather than the rights of the accused.
And the justification is deterrence and efficiency.
Right. The idea is that swift and certain processing appears efficient, deters potential criminals. If you offend, you'll likely be caught and punished quickly, and ultimately leads to a safer society by incapacitating the guilty.
So classicism clearly informs the due process side of things. But you said the rational actor model as an explanation for crime faded for much of the 20th century. So where does this populist conservative revival fit in? When did the rational actor come back as an explanation?
That's the big shift in the latter part of the 20th century. For most of that century, as an explanation for why crime happens, the rational actor model was largely overshadowed by predestined actor models, sociological theories focusing on poverty, inequality, subcultures, or psychological theories about personality disorders, trauma, etc. But it came back with a vengeance, starting roughly in the 1970s and gaining real momentum in the 80s, propelled by the rise of the new political right, populist conservatives or neoconservatives in the US and the UK.
What was their take on crime? Why did they bring back the rational actor idea?
Well, conservative intellectuals in both countries mounted what the source describes as a moral campaign against deviance and permissiveness. They saw rising crime rates as a symptom of a deeper cultural malaise. Margaret Thatcher in the UK explicitly made crime a major election issue in 1979.
A cultural problem.
Yes, they aimed to reestablish what they termed Victorian values and push back against the social changes of the 1960s, the permissive society. They felt that modern culture, with its emphasis on subjective values and self-expression, had undermined traditional sources of authority and self-control.
And they linked this directly to crime.
They did. They argued that this cultural shift made individuals less willing to achieve through legitimate means and less willing to obey rules. They looked back to tradition, to the authority of the state, schools, and the family as anchors that needed restoring.
And how did this translate into criminology? What did they think of the dominant theories of the time?
They were deeply critical. They saw what they called liberal indulgence in the prevailing criminological models. The predestined actor model, which focused on finding the causes of crime, poverty, psychology, and advocated treatment or rehabilitation instead of just punishment, was seen as making excuses for criminals.
And the more critical theories.
Similarly, the victimized actor model associated with radical criminology, which critiqued social injustice and argued for understanding or even forgiveness for offenders caught in unfair systems, these were blamed too. Right-wing intellectuals argued that this kind of progressive theorizing wasn't just explaining crime, it was contributing to it by legitimizing deviance and undermining personal responsibility.
So they believed the theories themselves were part of the problem.
That was the argument. High crime and disorder were blamed not just on weakening social institutions like the family, schools, and religion, but also on this corrosive culture that emphasized rights over obligations, self-indulgence over self-control. Crime and violence, in this view, had inevitably increased as a result.
So the solution wasn't understanding causes, it was
Confrontation, reasserting the necessity of authority, order, discipline, challenging what they saw as sociological apologies for bad behavior. This was a direct assault on the liberal and radical trends in criminology and social policy. And they found some ammunition. Robert Martinson's famous 1974 paper, which reviewed studies of rehabilitation programs and concluded, somewhat controversially, that nothing works, or at least that widespread effectiveness couldn't be proven. This was seized upon as empirical justification for abandoning the rehabilitative ideal and questioning things like probation.
Leading back towards punishment.
Exactly, an enthusiastic reintroduction of retributive punishment. Crime, especially serious crime, was framed as evil, something that needed to be punished firmly to protect society and, importantly, to reinforce core social values. The focus shifted squarely back onto the offender as someone who had made a morally wrong choice and deserved consequences, not primarily as someone needing treatment or understanding. This, as the source notes, is a contemporary form of the rational actor model, but with a very distinct, sharp, retributive edge.
And the source singles out James Q. Wilson in the U.S. as a key architect of this perspective, often called right realism.
Yes, Wilson is absolutely central. His 1975 book, Thinking About Crime, was incredibly influential. He was also an advisor to Republican presidents like Nixon and Reagan, who came into office with mandates to get tough on crime. Wilson's later work especially carries this harder, more retributive element.
What was Wilson's core argument? Did he just dismiss all other factors?
Interestingly, Wilson actually accepted some of the liberal arguments, for instance, that simply hiring more police or imposing slightly longer sentences might not dramatically reduce overall crime rates on their own, but he was absolutely scathing towards anyone who, in his view, denied that crime was a real, serious problem that demanded a concerted, rigorous response. The central idea of right realism is crime is simply an evil and we need to tackle it head on.
So, if just adding police patrols doesn't work, what should police be doing, according to this view?
This is where Wilson, collaborating with George Kelling, introduced the famous broken windows concept, though the source describes the idea without using that specific term. Their argument was that the police's primary role shouldn't just be reacting to serious crime, but actively maintaining social order.
Broken windows, the idea that visible signs of disorder, like graffiti or broken windows, if left untended, signal that nobody cares, which then encourages more serious crime.
Exactly. Kelling argued that you ignore minor offenses and signs of disorder at your peril. Disorder creates fear, it makes residents withdraw, and it acts as a precursor to serious crime.
So tackling the small stuff prevents bigger problems.
That's the theory. Conversely, if police actively maintain order dealing with things like public drunkenness, aggressive begging, loitering gangs, vandalism, it allows informal community controls to flourish. Law-abiding citizens feel safer, more engaged, and it creates an environment where criminality finds it harder to take root. The focus shifts from solely enforcing criminal law to regulating street life and controlling these incivilities.
Incivilities, things that aren't necessarily major crimes, but degrade quality of life.
Yes. Prostitution, noisy groups, litter, intimidation. Individually may be minor, but in aggregate they are seen as deeply detrimental to community well-being and signal a breakdown of control requiring intervention.
Now, right realists were suspicious of calls for treatment from the predestined actor camp. But did they completely ignore biological or psychological factors themselves?
Not entirely, which is interesting. Wilson, in later work with Richard Herrnstein, actually proposed a biosocial explanation for crime.
Biosocial.
Yes, they acknowledged that an individual's inclination towards crime could vary based on factors like internalized self-control, which depends partly on how well society invests in socializing its members, but also on certain inherent genetic or biological characteristics. Though importantly, they didn't see these as fixed destiny.
So biology might put someone more at risk, but it's not deterministic.
That was their argument. Biology might establish the population potentially at risk, but whether that risk translates into actual criminal behavior depends heavily on socialization, particularly within the family, so it connects back to biology and conditioning. But Wilson didn't really pursue this avenue for policy solutions.
Why not?
Because, pragmatically, he argued it's very difficult to change someone's biological predispositions, and it's also very difficult for the state to quickly or effectively improve family socialization processes on a mass scale, though populist politicians certainly tried through welfare reforms and rhetoric about family values. So the practical aim became reduce criminality through interventions that make the benefits of an honest life more attractive, but primarily make the costs of crime much higher.
And the source says Wilson really concentrated on the costs. How did he explain the criminal choice itself?
He adopted a straightforwardly utilitarian, rational choice explanation. The source quotes him from 1975, making this calculus explicit. Quote, if the supply and value of legitimate opportunities was declining at the very time that the cost of illegitimate opportunities was also declining, a rational teenager might well have concluded that it made more sense to steal cars than to wash them.
So it's a cost-benefit analysis. If crime pays better or costs less, people will choose it.
That's the logic. Now, this utilitarian view logically implies you should both increase the benefits of non-crime, like creating jobs, and increase the costs of crime, like imprisonment. But in practice, Wilson's emphasis, and the emphasis of populist conservative policy that followed, leaned very heavily on increasing the costs. The stick became the primary tool.
Okay, so focusing on punishment and deterrence. Did right realists agree on how punishment should work?
There were some nuances. Wilson, looking at the U.S. situation where imprisonment rates were already rising, actually stressed certainty over sheer severity, echoing Beccaria in a way. He noted that the U.S. locked up a large proportion of offenders for long periods, yet other countries with lower crime rates didn't necessarily do the same, implying severity alone wasn't the magic bullet.
So it's not just about long sentences.
Right. The deterrent value of an arrest depends on whether it leads to conviction and actual consequences. Offenders, Wilson argued, make decisions based on the perceived probability of punishment, not just its potential length. He and Herrnstein wrote that consequences lose their power to control behavior if they're too delayed or improbable.
The source uses Felson's analogy here, doesn't it?
Yes, Marcus Felson's hot stove analogy.
Right,
it's very vivid. A real hot stove deters you effectively because the consequence is immediate, certain, and usually involves minor pain. An imaginary stove that only burns you one time in 500 and the pain doesn't arrive for 5 months that doesn't deter anyone. It powerfully illustrates the importance of certainty and swiftness.
So the solution, according to right realism, involves catching more offenders and making the justice system more consistent.
Exactly. Improve police effectiveness to increase the certainty of being caught. And improve the consistency of the criminal justice system so that being caught leads reliably to punishment. They noted that poor police public relations, especially in high crime, often minority communities, were a major obstacle because they blocked the flow of information and cooperation needed to catch offenders.
And Wilson and Herrnstein actually argued against very long sentences sometimes.
Yes, partly because they feared extreme sentences might be perceived as unfair or inequitable, potentially prompting revenge offending or making judges reluctant to impose them, thus undermining the crucial principle of certainty. If judges don't consistently apply the sentence, its deterrent effect weakens.
What about the general deterrent value of punishment?
On deterrence, they took a very traditional rational actor stance. They lamented what they saw as the irrationality of the justice system itself, citing judges who didn't believe prison deterred and low rates of imprisonment even for known recidivists. They called for fixed-term sentences based on the crime, regardless of the offender's age or attributes like potential for rehabilitation.
And this brings up that moral dilemma the source mentions regarding differential sentencing based on risk.
Yes, this is a major ethical criticism leveled against risk-based sentencing. If you sentence based on perceived future risk, then factors like age, employment status, family stability, and unfortunately, often race and class come into play. A young, poor, black offender from an unstable background might be deemed higher risk and get a longer sentence than an older, white, middle-class offender from a stable family who committed the exact same crime. Realists tended to sidestep this by focusing on incapacitation as the primary justification for imprisonment.
Incapacitation meaning just locking people up so they physically can't commit crimes?
Precisely. Their argument was stark. Known recidivists commit a disproportionate amount of crime. Therefore, certainly locking up known offenders, particularly those in specific high offending categories, even for relatively brief but definite periods, must reduce the crime rate simply by taking them off the streets. This loss of liberty didn't necessarily have to be traditional long-term prison. It could be overnight or weekend confinement, as long as it was certain and rigorously enforced. It's essentially applying a neoclassical focus on offender types, but channeling it towards deterrence, definite sentencing, and incapacitation.
The source concludes this section with that very stark quote from Wilson's Thinking About Crime.
Yes, it really sums up the worldview. Wicked people exist. Nothing avails except to keep them apart from innocent people. And many people, neither wicked nor innocent, but watchful, dissembling, and calculating of their opportunities, ponder our reaction to wickedness as a cue to what they might profitably do.
Watchful, dissembling, and calculating. It paints a picture of a society where many people are constantly weighing their options, ready to exploit weakness if the perceived cost is low enough.
It absolutely does. And this worldview also led them to emphasize upholding public order and morality much more broadly.
Yeah.
While liberals might have called for decriminalizing certain street offenses like prostitution or recreational drug use, right, realists demanded more rigorous control.
Targeting small-time users, too.
Yes, particularly for drugs. Their rationale was that even casual use attacked the fiber of the community and needed to be confronted, perhaps even more so than dealers or addicts deemed beyond help. It was about reinforcing norms. And Wilson and Kelling's focus on incivilities fits here too. They argued for intervening against behavior that wasn't even strictly criminal things, like abandoned properties, rowdy kids hanging out, litter, noise, intimidation. Why? Because these things signal social decline, create fear, and act as preconditions for higher crime rates. The justification wasn't necessarily direct harm, but the impact on community life, especially for the poor, arguing that controlling individual behavior was more achievable than demanding large-scale structural changes.
And they suggested targeting intervention strategically.
Yes, focus order maintenance efforts on areas deemed at high risk of tipping into high crime, areas where order could potentially still be restored. For areas where crime was already endemic, the prescription was different. Fewer resources for simply restoring order, but instead a more comprehensive assault on criminality itself, more intensive policing focused on detecting and prosecuting offenses, and a particularly vigorous response for repeat offenders.
This policy focus sounds like it would inevitably lead to things like the three strikes laws in the U.S.
It absolutely did. The 3 strikes and you're out policy is a prime example of this thinking put into practice, mandating incredibly long sentences, often 25 years to life, for a third felony conviction, regardless of whether that third offense was serious or relatively minor.
And the statistics cited in the source are pretty staggering.
They really are. By 2002, around 6,700 people in the U.S. were serving these 25 to life sentences under 3 strikes laws. Over half of them, about 3,350, were for nonviolent offenses. And perhaps most shockingly, 350 were serving these incredibly long sentences for petty theft. And the racial disparities were stark: 44% Black, 26% Latino. It meant relatively minor offenses could realistically lead to decades behind bars. This is truly the rational actor model, revived with a focus on incapacitation. Crime as individual choice, best prevented by reducing opportunity, increasing detection, and applying definite, severe, certain punishment.
The source provides more data showing the massive impact of these ideas on U.S. policy overall.
Yes, the numbers speak volumes. The U.S. prison population crossed the 2 million mark in 2002. It was and remains the largest prison population in the world and the highest incarceration rate proportionally. The number nearly doubled just between 1990 and 2002, largely credited to get tough sentencing laws, mandatory minimums, longer sentences, particularly for drug offenses, and policies like 3 strikes.
And the racial disparity figures.
Profoundly disturbing. In 2002, an estimated 12% of all Black men in their 20s and 30s were incarcerated, compared to just 1.6% of white men in the same age group. Overall, about 1 in every 142 people in the U.S. was in prison or jail. And while the U.S. is an extreme example, the source notes England and Wales also saw significant increases in their prison populations during the 1990s and early 2000s, reflecting a similar policy emphasis on incapacitation. And perhaps the ultimate symbol of this retributive turn, as the source points out, is the enthusiastic reintroduction and use of capital punishment in many U.S. states over the past few decades.
Which is ironic, given Beccaria saw it as uncivilized and unnecessary for deterrence.
Exactly. But from a strict right realist, rational actor perspective, focused on retribution and incapacitation for the wicked, it fits. And what's particularly striking, and highlighted by the Amnesty International report cited, is the willingness in some U.S. jurisdictions to apply this ultimate penalty even to individuals who committed their crimes as minors, treating them as fully rational adults. The fact that the U.S. and Somalia were noted as the only UN members then not to have ratified the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which bans executing juvenile offenders, speaks volumes about how far this particular application of rational actor thinking went.
Okay, so that's a comprehensive look at right realism and its policy impact. But it certainly hasn't been without its critics. What are the main criticisms raised in the source material?
Right. Before diving into the critiques, maybe it's helpful to quickly list the 10 core propositions the source uses to summarize the right realist perspective. Things like crime is freely chosen, causes are irrelevant for policy, punishment is effective, rehabilitation often isn't. Crime is a real problem rooted in declining morality. It's best prevented by deterrence, surveillance, and strong authority, and the focus should be on practical crime control and order maintenance.
Okay, so those are the core tenets. Now for the criticisms.
The source outlines several major ones. First, the narrow focus on street crime. Right? Realism heavily prioritizes street criminality, burglary, robbery, assault, public disorder, while virtually ignoring or downplaying white-collar and corporate crime.
Why is that a problem?
Because, as critics point out, corporate crimes think financial fraud, environmental pollution, unsafe products are enormously costly to the economy and society, often far more so in aggregate than street crime. While street crime is more visible and directly generates fear of crime, the impact of corporate wrongdoing can be vast, affecting pensions, health, the environment. Right realism tends to focus on the crime that frightens the core electorate most directly.
Okay, what's the second major criticism?
Ignoring structural factors. It tends to dismiss or minimize the role of broader social and economic variables like poverty, inequality, unemployment, and social exclusion as causes of crime. The focus remains resolutely on individual choice, inadequate socialization, or lack of moral values. Furthermore, that proposed causal link between minor incivilities, broken windows, and serious criminality has actually been quite difficult to substantiate empirically. Some studies, like Matthews's research in the UK cited in the source, found that factors like poverty levels and the availability of public services were actually more significant drivers of urban decline and crime than the presence of incivilities alone.
Third criticism.
Effectively abandoning high crime areas. The Wilson and Kelling suggestion that areas with the most deeply entrenched social problems and criminality might not be worth saving in terms of order maintenance is seen as highly problematic. Critics argue this effectively writes off entire communities. The inhabitants face harsh punishment if they offend, but are left unprotected and disadvantaged in high-crime environments if they don't. They are implicitly blamed for their own predicament, seen as having failed to socialize their children properly or maintain order themselves. Targeting the disadvantaged through order maintenance. Focusing police efforts on controlling minor public order offenses like begging, vagrancy, or loitering can easily slide into interventions of dubious legality that unfairly target already marginalized and disadvantaged groups, like the homeless. Problems with police accountability. Traditionally, clear-up rates for reported crimes served as a key, if imperfect, indicator of police performance. Shifting the focus towards a more ambiguous goal, like maintaining social order or controlling incivilities, makes it much harder to measure police efficiency and effectiveness objectively. More worryingly, critics argue, giving police a broad, flexible mandate to control potentially non-criminal behavior makes ensuring police accountability and professionalism much more difficult. Where are the clear lines?
And the final major criticism mentioned.
Demonization and punitive state. Critics argue that this whole rediscovery of the rational actor model, framed as crime resulting from a lack of correct moral values, has fueled the targeting and demonization of specific, often marginalized social groups. The source mentions New Age travelers, drug users, unemployed young men. These groups become scapegoats, justifying an increasingly intrusive and punitive law and order state that deems them worthy of harsh punishment rather than social support or understanding. And just to round that off, the source brings in an early right realist, Ernest van den Haag, from 1975, who was remarkably explicit about the political dimension of these ideas and quite dismissive of such criticisms.
What was van den Haag's perspective?
He basically argued, quite bluntly, that capitalism inevitably creates winners and losers. For the system to work, the winners, the wealth creators and accumulators, the core members of society with access to opportunities, must be protected from the losers, the underclass, the criminals who might try to take their wealth. Crime control, in this view, is fundamentally about protecting the interests of the successful majority who provide the electoral support for these tough-on-crime policies. It overtly connects the criminology to a specific political and economic agenda.
Wow, okay, that has been a really comprehensive journey. We've gone all the way from the Enlightenment thinkers, Beccaria and Bentham, laying down these systematic principles of rational choice, free will, proportionality.
Trying to build a logical, fair system out of chaos.
Right. Then seeing how the messy reality of human difference forced that neoclassical compromise, trying to balance free will with circumstance.
Introducing experts, individualizing sentences, the beginnings of rehabilitation.
And then this huge leap forward to the late 20th century, seeing how populist conservative thinking and right realism revived that core rational actor idea. But this time with a real focus on certainty, on incapacitation, on order maintenance, and often with that harder retributive edge.
We've definitely seen the logical appeal and the undeniable impact this whole rational actor perspective has had on shaping our legal systems and influencing policy, but we've also seen its significant limitations and the very serious critiques it faces, particularly around ignoring individual differences in social context, its narrow focus on certain types of crime, and the real-world consequences, sometimes quite harsh, of the policies it inspired.
It really forces you to confront those core questions again, doesn't it? Is crime really just a straightforward, rational choice for everyone? How much is down to individual responsibility versus how much are people shaped or constrained by their circumstances? And flowing from that, what does our answer mean for how we actually design our justice system? What should its primary goals be?
Absolutely. That fundamental tension between free will and determinism, between due process and crime control, between focusing on the crime versus focusing on the criminal, it's not resolved. It's still being debated and negotiated in policy and practice every single day.
So maybe here's a final thought for you, our listener, to chew on, prompted by Wilson's description of many people being watchful, dissembling, and calculating of their opportunities. If we accept, even partly, that many people are making these kinds of calculations, weighing the costs and benefits of legitimate versus illegitimate actions, what does that really imply about the kinds of social environments and, crucially, the kinds of opportunities society should be trying to create or perhaps deny? And how do we even begin to balance influencing those calculations, maybe making crime seem like a bad bet, with the equally important goals of protecting individual liberties and addressing the genuine deep-seated circumstances that might push someone towards making that rational choice for crime in the first place?
It's a complex calculation for society, too.
It really is. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the rational actor model based on Roger Hopkins Burke's book. We'll continue unpacking different ways of thinking about crime next time.